December 16, 1944. Ardennes, Belgium. 5:30 a.m. Lieutenant Colonel Joachim Peiper observes his elite troops advancing through the icy fog when something unexpected happens. His forces have just captured the small town of Honsfeld, surprising American soldiers still sleeping in their barracks. But what Peiper found in this small Belgian town would forever change his perspective on the war. Before him stretched endless rows of fuel cans, captured from the Americans. Approximately 50,000 gallons. For Peiper, this seemed like a gift from heaven. The German offensive in the Ardennes desperately depended on fuel, and this capture could mean the difference between advance and collapse. But then, a disturbing question arose in his mind. If this is just the reserve of a single American convoy, how vast are the resources they possess? If you're enjoying this incredible story, leave your like and subscribe to the channel for more content like this. Turn on notifications so you don't miss any videos. To fully understand the impact of this moment, we need to go back a few hours in time. Operation Wacht am Rhein, known to the Allies as the Battle of the Bulge, had begun in the early hours of that same day. Hitler had bet everything on this surprise offensive, concentrating his last reserves in a desperate attack through the Belgian forests. The objective was ambitious: divide the Allied forces, recapture the port of Antwerp, and force a separate peace with the British and Americans. Joachim Peiper, at 29 years old, commanded Kampfgruppe Peiper, an elite task force composed of Panther and Tiger tanks, veteran soldiers, and armored vehicles. His mission was clear: advance rapidly through enemy lines, capture strategic bridges over the Meuse River, and open the way for the rest of the German army. But there was a critical problem that haunted the entire operation: fuel shortage. German tanks were powerful machines, but they were also extremely thirsty for fuel. Each Panzer IV consumed approximately 300 liters per 100 kilometers, and the heavy Tigers consumed even more. Germany, incessantly bombed by the Allies, had its refineries destroyed and its supply routes cut. When the first lights of dawn illuminated Honsfeld, Peiper and his men found a scene that seemed straight out of a dream. The small town was filled with abandoned American equipment: Sherman tanks, trucks, artillery, and most importantly, enormous fuel depots. The American soldiers, caught completely by surprise, barely had time to react. Many were still in their sleeping bags when the German panzers roared through the narrow streets of the town. The sound of diesel engines echoed between the stone buildings, mixed with shouts of command in German and the metallic noise of tank tracks on the frozen pavement. Peiper got down from his command vehicle and walked among the captured depots. The strong smell of gasoline and diesel hung in the cold morning air. His boots made dry sounds on the compacted snow as he inspected row after row of metal cans. 50,000 gallons. It was more fuel than his unit had seen in months. His soldiers immediately began the refueling process, filling the tanks of their panzers with the precious American liquid. Troop morale instantly soared. Finally, they could continue their advance without worrying about the range of their vehicles. But it was exactly at this moment of euphoria that something disturbing began to form in Peiper's mind. As he watched his men working feverishly to transfer the fuel, he began to make mental calculations. 50,000 gallons were enough to completely refuel his task force and still have a considerable amount left over. But then, information obtained during the interrogation of American prisoners left him deeply uneasy. Those 50,000 gallons were not a main depot or strategic reserve. It was simply the fuel stock of a single American supply convoy, a common routine convoy that was passing through the region to refuel units on the front line. Peiper felt a chill down his spine that had nothing to do with the Belgian weather. If a single American convoy carried as much fuel as his entire task force had seen in months, this meant that Allied resources were much larger than any German estimate had predicted. He began to visualize hundreds, perhaps thousands of similar convoys crossing Europe, each carrying unimaginable quantities of supplies. Peiper's analytical mind, trained at the military academy and tempered by years of combat, began to process the implications of this discovery. He knew that Germany had been rationing fuel for more than a year. Every liter was counted, every tank movement was carefully planned to maximize efficiency. German units frequently became immobilized due to lack of fuel, forced to abandon perfectly functional equipment simply because there was no way to fuel them. Meanwhile, the Americans apparently had so much fuel that they could afford to transport 50,000 gallons in a single routine convoy. Peiper began to make mental comparisons that left him increasingly uncomfortable. How many convoys like this did the Americans have? How many factories were producing fuel 24 hours a day on the other side of the Atlantic? How many tanker ships crossed the ocean daily, loaded with resources that Germany could only dream of possessing? The math was simple and terrifying. If the Americans could casually transport 50,000 gallons in a single convoy, their total production and logistics capacity must be astronomical. At this moment, Peiper remembered intelligence reports he had read months before, but which at the time seemed exaggerated or Allied propaganda. Reports about American factories producing one Sherman tank every hour, about shipyards building Liberty ships in a matter of days, about refineries processing millions of barrels of oil monthly. At the time, these numbers seemed impossible, propaganda designed to discourage German forces. But now, faced with 50,000 gallons of fuel from a single convoy, these reports began to make sense. The Americans weren't just fighting a war, they had transformed their entire country into a war machine. While Germany struggled to keep its factories running under constant bombing, the United States was producing war material on a scale that defied comprehension. Peiper realized he wasn't just fighting against American soldiers, he was fighting against the entire industrial capacity of a nation that had completely mobilized its economy for war. The revelation brought with it a cascade of other disturbing perceptions. Peiper began to understand that the war was no longer a matter of brilliant tactics or individual courage on the battlefield. It had become a war of attrition, a competition of resources and production capacity. And, in this competition, Germany was hopelessly disadvantaged. He thought of German cities being bombed night and day, of destroyed factories, of cut supply routes. Meanwhile, American factories operated in safety, protected by two oceans, producing war material in quantities that seemed infinite. The German blitzkrieg strategy, which had worked so well in the early years of the conflict, depended on quick and decisive victories. But now, facing an enemy with apparently inexhaustible resources, the war had transformed into exactly the kind of prolonged conflict that Germany could not win. Each passing day, the resource disparity became more evident and more decisive. Peiper also began to reflect on the human implications of this discovery. His soldiers, brave and dedicated men, were fighting with increasingly scarce and obsolete equipment, while facing enemies equipped with new and abundant material. They were being sent into battles where courage and individual skill were increasingly irrelevant in the face of the enemy's overwhelming material superiority. How many of his men would die not for lack of bravery or competence, but simply because they were fighting a war that was already lost at the logistical level? The responsibility he felt for his troops became even heavier. As a leader, he had the duty to protect his men and fulfill his mission. But how could he do this when the mission itself seemed based on a fundamentally incorrect understanding of the strategic reality? The capture of the 50,000 gallons, which should have been a moment of triumph, had transformed into a moment of terrible clarity about the futility of their efforts. While his soldiers continued the refueling work, Peiper stepped away from the group and found a moment of silence to process his conclusions. The distant sound of artillery echoed through the snow-covered hills, reminding him that the battle continued. But for him, something fundamental had changed. The war was no longer about victory or defeat in the traditional sense. It was about how long Germany could continue fighting before its resources were completely exhausted. He realized he was participating not in a military campaign, but in the last gasps of a doomed war effort. The irony of the situation did not go unnoticed. At the moment when he had captured enough resources to continue his offensive with tactical success, he had realized that the war, in a broader strategic sense, was already lost. The 50,000 gallons could allow his forces to advance a few more kilometers, perhaps capture a few more towns, but they could not alter the final outcome of a conflict determined by industrial capacity and resources. Peiper's psychological transformation at that moment reflects a broader truth about World War II. The war had become, fundamentally, a competition between economic and industrial systems. Germany, despite its tactical and technological excellence in many areas, simply could not compete with the combined production capacity of the Allies. The United States, in particular, had demonstrated an industrial mobilization capacity that completely transformed the nature of modern warfare. Factories that previously produced automobiles were converted to produce tanks. Shipyards that built merchant ships were adapted to produce warships. The entire American economy was reorganized to support the war effort, creating a military production machine unprecedented in history. This transformation was not just a matter of quantity, but also of quality and innovation. The Americans not only produced more equipment, they also constantly developed new technologies and improved their production processes. For Peiper, The discovery at Honsfeld represented the moment when propaganda met reality. For years, German leadership had minimized American industrial capacity, describing the United States as a nation of merchants without the will to fight. But the 50,000 gallons of fuel from a single convoy told a very different story. They revealed a nation that had completely mobilized its resources for war, that could produce and transport military material on a scale that defied German comprehension. This was not the America of Nazi propaganda, but an industrial superpower determined to win the war through absolute material superiority. Peiper realized that he and his compatriots had been victims of their own propaganda, believing in a version of reality that prevented them from truly understanding the magnitude of the challenge they faced. The war was not just against American, British, and Soviet soldiers, it was against the entire productive capacity of the industrialized world. Peiper's experience at Honsfeld also illustrates how individual moments can reveal broader historical truths. A single event, the capture of a fuel depot, can serve as a window to understand much larger historical forces. World War II was, in many ways, the first truly industrial war, where victory was determined not only by military strategy, but by the ability to produce, transport, and sustain enormous quantities of war material. The 50,000 gallons captured by Peiper represented only a small fraction of the vast logistical machine that sustained the Allied war effort. Each gallon was the product of a production chain that extended from the oil fields of Texas to the refineries of New Jersey, passing through tanker ships that crossed the Atlantic and convoys that traversed Europe. This logistical network, multiplied by thousands of different products, created a military sustainment capacity that Germany simply could not match. Peiper's moment of revelation also highlights the importance of accurate information in war. For a long time, German leadership had operated based on incorrect estimates about Allied industrial capacity. They had systematically underestimated the speed with which Americans could mobilize their economy for war and the scale of production they could achieve. This lack of accurate information led to strategic decisions based on false premises, including Operation Wacht am Rhein itself. The Ardennes Offensive was planned based on the belief that the Allies could not sustain a prolonged war of attrition. But Peiper's discovery revealed that the Allies not only could sustain such a war, but actually thrived in it. The longer the war became, the greater the Allied advantage would be. This understanding came too late to alter the course of the war, but served as a painful lesson about the importance of accurate intelligence in military decision-making. Finally, the story of Peiper and the 50,000 gallons reminds us that war is, ultimately, about people. Behind all the production statistics, all the tons of material, and all the gallons of fuel were individuals making decisions that would affect the course of history. Peiper was a professional soldier, trained to follow orders and fulfill missions. But at that moment in Honsfeld, he was forced to confront the reality that his orders were based on a fundamentally flawed understanding of the strategic situation. His transformation from confident commander to disillusioned soldier reflects the experience of many German military personnel in the final years of the war, when the disparity between official propaganda and battlefield reality became impossible to ignore. The war would continue for a few more months, but for Peiper, the moment of truth had arrived in a small Belgian town, before rows of fuel cans that told a story he would have preferred not to hear. This story teaches us that sometimes the greatest revelations come at the most unexpected moments. A German commander, at the height of a tactical victory, discovered the strategic truth that would seal his nation's fate. The 50,000 gallons of fuel were not just military resources, they were symbols of an industrial capacity that would forever transform the nature of modern warfare. If this story made you reflect on how small moments can reveal great truths, leave a comment sharing your thoughts. And if you want to learn more fascinating stories from World War II that reveal surprising aspects of the conflict, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. In the next video, we will explore another decisive moment that changed the course of history. See you then.